The sheriff stepped into my living room at exactly 7:14 p.m., and nobody in my family even noticed him at first. My father, Raymond, was too busy pointing at the expensive landscape painting above my fireplace, pretending to admire a house he had spent the last 4 years resenting me for owning. My younger brother, Dean, was lounging at my dining table with his legs spread wide, drinking my 18-year-old bourbon like he already owned the place. And my mother, she just kept pacing, shifting her eyes around the room the exact way nervous people do when they know they are somewhere they absolutely do not belong. Then Sheriff Walter Briggs cleared his throat. That single sound stopped everything. Dean nearly dropped his glass. My father slowly turned around, and Walter, calm as a winter morning, removed his hat and said, "Evening, Raymond." I watched the blood instantly drain from my father's face. That was the exact second he realized this was not a family reunion. It was a reckoning. 4 years earlier, I never could have imagined sitting in this Colorado mountain house with cameras recording every single word my family said. Back then, I was still the obedient daughter from Ash Creek, Ohio. The daughter who did what she was told, the daughter my father traded away like cattle. I was 24 years old when Raymond Carter informed me I was getting married. Not asked, told. It happened on a Thursday evening in late October, right after supper. I can still smell the beef stew hanging thick in the kitchen air while the freezing rain tapped against the farmhouse windows. Dad sat at the head of the table with both hands folded like a corrupt banker closing a crooked deal. Mom kept drying the exact same plate over and over again, refusing to look up, and Dean leaned back in his chair smirking before anyone even said a word. That smirk should have warned me. "Victor Hale asked for you," my father said. I laughed at first, not because it was funny, but because it sounded completely insane. Victor Hale was almost 60 years old, and he owned half the commercial property in 3 counties. People around Ash Creek spoke his name in whispers, like they were discussing a dangerous ghost. 2 wives dead, one drowned at his lake house, another fell down a massive staircase in Denver. No charges, no proof, just rumors thick enough to stick to a man forever. "You cannot be serious," I said. Dad stared at me cold and hard. "I already gave him my word," he said. That one sentence changed my life forever. I remember standing up so fast my chair scraped violently across the old linoleum floor. "You gave him your word?" I asked. "What about me?" Dean snorted into his drink. Mom whispered Elena, but she still would not look at me. Dad's jaw tightened. "You know what is happening to this farm," he snapped. I did know. The drought had nearly ruined the crops, but my father had borrowed against the land 3 separate times. There were dark rumors in town that he owed massive amounts of money way beyond the bank loans. Gambling, cards, sports betting, the kind of debt small-town men swear they can control until the sharks come to collect. "You are selling me," I said quietly. Dad slammed his open palm on the wood table, making the dishes rattle. "I am saving this family," he roared. I still remember how utterly frozen I felt standing there. Not angry at first, just cold, like something deep inside me finally understood I had never truly belonged to myself. "He killed his wives," I whispered. "That is nothing but gossip," Dad snapped. "Then why won't anyone say it to his face?" Nobody answered, not a single person, not even my own mother. And that silence hurt worst of all. Victor Hale arrived 2 days later. A sleek black Lincoln rolled up our gravel driveway just after noon. I expected some terrifying monster from the town gossip, but what stepped out completely caught me off guard. Victor was tall, but he moved stiffly like his own body cut him with pain. Silver hair, a tailored dark overcoat, and sharp, intense eyes that looked more exhausted than cruel. He shook my father's hand first. That told me everything I needed to know. Business before family. Then he turned his gaze to me. It was not the way a man chooses livestock, and it was not the way a groom looks at a bride. It was more like an old soldier studying the structural damage in another human being because he recognized the exact same fractures in himself. "You do not want this marriage," he said plainly. The sheer honesty caught me off guard. "No," I answered. Dad immediately barked Elena, but Victor raised one long hand gently. "She is allowed to answer," he said. Silence settled heavy over the porch. Then Victor looked directly into my eyes again. "Neither do I," he said. That confused me even more. We sat in the living room afterward while Dad rambled endlessly about land permits and grain prices, but Victor barely listened. Eventually, Victor asked if he could speak to me privately outside. Dad hesitated, but Victor did not wait for his permission. We walked down toward the rusted fence line where dead corn stalks bent double under the biting autumn wind. Victor kept both hands deep in his coat pockets. "You have heard stories about me," he said. "Yes," I replied, "and do you believe them?" I looked at his worn face carefully. "I do not know what to believe anymore." He nodded slowly. "That is probably the smartest answer anyone has given me in years," he said. There was absolutely no charm in him, no false sweetness. Just pure tactical exhaustion. He explained everything. His first wife had drowned after drinking during a massive storm at the lake. The second had struggled with a severe prescription medication addiction for years before her tragic accident. "People prefer monsters," he said quietly. "It makes their boring lives feel simpler." I asked him the one question burning in my chest. "Why do you want to marry me then?" His answer stayed with me forever. "Because your father desperately needed money," he said, "and because I got tired of eating dinner alone." No romance, no manipulation, just a truth so bare and naked it actually hurt to hear. I should have walked away anyway. Maybe a stronger woman would have run into the woods. But small town daughters raised by brutal men understand something outsiders will never grasp. Sometimes obedience gets planted in your bones so young it literally feels like survival. 3 weeks later, I married Victor Hale at the county courthouse. No church wedding, no white dress, no reception. Just ink signatures, cold mountain weather, and my mother crying silently into cheap tissues she pretended not to need. Dad shook Victor's hand afterward like he had just closed the deal of a lifetime. That specific image haunted my nightmares for years. The first few months in Colorado felt incredibly strange and lonely. Victor's estate sat way outside Cedar Ridge, tucked high against the rugged mountains where the heavy snow lingered deep into late spring. The place was absolutely enormous, but it was quiet. Too quiet. At night, I would lie awake listening to the old heating pipes ticking through the dark walls, wondering whether I had willingly trapped myself inside a custom-made grave waiting to happen. But Victor never touched me cruelly. He never yelled. He never controlled where I went or who I talked to. Mostly, he just worked brutal hours in his private study reviewing thick contracts and complex financial papers. Some evenings, we ate dinner in complete, unbroken silence. Other nights, he surprised me by talking for hours about local ranchers, old Western movies, and historical mining disputes. Slowly, the paralyzing fear I carried began changing its shape. It did not disappear, it just turned into profound confusion. One snowy evening, about 8 months into the arrangement, I finally stood up and asked him directly to his face, "Did you love your wives?" Victor stared deep into the roaring fireplace for a long time before answering. "Yes," he said softly, and I buried both of them. There was something so deeply broken in his voice that no liar on earth could ever fake. That was the exact night I realized Victor Hale might not be the villain my hometown needed him to be. And maybe, just maybe, neither was I. By the second year of our marriage, I knew two things for absolute certain. First, Victor Hale was not the monster from the rumors. And second, somebody very close to him was actively waiting for him to die. I just did not know their name yet. People imagine extreme wealth looks glamorous from the inside. It does not. Not the kind of wealth Victor possessed. Old money has a crushing heaviness to it, a suffocating loneliness, especially for men who spend decades wondering whether a single person around them actually cares if they wake up tomorrow. Victor rarely trusted anyone fully. At first, I assumed it was just billionaire arrogance. Later, I understood it was pure survival. Every single week, somebody wanted something from him. Business partners begging for signatures, distant relatives demanding temporary loans, slick lawyers, pushing him to revise ownership agreements. Even charity boards treated him less like a human being and more like a vault with legs. One morning during breakfast, I found him staring blankly out the kitchen windows toward the jagged peaks while his untouched coffee grew cold beside him. Snow covered the backyard fences in smooth, blinding white drifts. "You did not sleep at all," I said. "I slept enough," he replied. You say that every single time you stay up all night, I said. A faint, genuine smile crossed his face. That small smile alone told me he was finally beginning to trust me. Victor was not naturally warm. His kindness came quietly, almost reluctantly, like someone who had entirely forgotten how to offer it. He folded his newspaper with precise care. Do you know why wealthy men become violently paranoid, Elena? He asked. I shrugged, because everybody lies to them. Because he said they finally realize money makes greedy people very patient. That sentence chilled me to the bone. At the time, I did not fully understand what he meant. I would very soon. Life in Cedar Ridge slowly settled into a routine. A quiet, comfortable routine. I started handling the basic household accounts, and eventually Victor surprised me by asking me to help him organize his massive commercial property records. He seemed genuinely shocked at how fast I picked it up. But the truth is, nobody had ever bothered to teach me anything important before. Back in Ohio, my father treated me like unpaid temporary labor until a marriage license could officially transfer ownership of my life to someone else. Victor, strangely enough, treated me like a real partner. Some evenings we sat for hours in his dimly lit study, surrounded by leather ledgers and complicated contracts, while old jazz records played softly from a turntable in the corner. He taught me exactly how commercial leases worked, how land rights skyrocketed in value near future interstate highways, and how desperate people always accidentally reveal their true motives during inheritance disputes. You can always tell who someone really is, Victor told me, by watching them divide money after a funeral. At the time, I thought he was just being cynical. Now I know he was just being experienced. Still, the toxic rumors followed me everywhere I went. At the local grocery store, women would completely stop talking the second I walked into the aisle. At church, people stared a little too long with plastic smiles. One afternoon, an older waitress in town squeezed my hand, tightly wiped her apron, and whispered, "Be very careful around stairs, honey." I drove home with my hands shaking violently on the steering wheel. Victor noticed the change in my energy immediately. He listened in complete silence as I repeated what the woman had whispered. Then he surprised me by laughing, not a cruel laugh. Just a deeply tired one. People need monsters, Elena, he said, especially in boring, dying towns. Aren't you furious? I asked. I stopped trying to defend my innocence years ago, he replied. Why? I asked. Because innocent people eventually learn a painful lesson that guilty people already know by heart. What is that? I whispered. The truth does not always matter. About 6 months later, I saw the darker, colder side of Victor's world. His billionaire business partner, Leonard Voss, came over for an intimate dinner. Leonard was one of those overly polished men who smiled with every single tooth in his skull, but never with his eyes. Perfect silver hair, an insanely expensive watch, and a voice as smooth as wet paint. The exact kind of man older women call charming and older men never trust for a single second. The moment he stepped inside the house, a thick, suffocating tension settled over Victor like a storm cloud. At the dinner table, Leonard made constant backhanded jokes about retirement. You should finally slow down, Vic, Leonard said. While aggressively cutting his steak, you need to enjoy whatever is left of your life. Victor's jaw tightened instantly. Whatever is left, he repeated. Leonard laughed way too quickly. Oh, you know exactly what I mean, old friend? I noticed something then. Fear. Not in Leonard. In Victor. Small, controlled, but entirely real. That night, after Leonard left, Victor personally checked every single lock on the exterior doors before sitting alone in the pitch-black living room with a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. You think he is stealing from you? Don't you? I said quietly from the doorway. Victor stared blankly into the dark. I know he is. Then why keep him around? Because men who panic become dangerous, Elena. Dangerous, how? I asked, feeling a cold sweat break out. The kind of dangerous that gets labeled as a tragic accident afterward. A month later, high-tech security cameras appeared all over the estate. Victor told the contractors it was because of mountain trespassers, but privately he admitted a terrifying truth to me. He no longer trusted a single soul entering his property. That included business associates, distant relatives, and especially my family. Soon after, retired Sheriff Walter Briggs began visiting us regularly. Walter was in his late 70s with broad shoulders, a thick white mustache, and a slow, booming voice that carried absolute authority without ever needing to shout. The first time we met, he shook my hand, firmly looked at Victor, and said, "Well, Vic, it looks like you finally found someone decent." About damn time. Victor rolled his eyes, but I saw the faint amusement in his face. Walter became part friend, part tactical security advisor, and part watchdog. Some afternoons, the three of us would sit on the back porch drinking black coffee, watching the snow melt across the valley below. Walter distrusted every single person connected to Victor's money, especially Leonard Voss. "Men who smile that much around large sums of cash make my stomach turn," Walter once muttered. Victor took a slow sip of his coffee. "You and me both, Walter." Despite all that heavy paranoia, something beautiful and unexpected happened between Victor and me. We became genuine companions, no dramatic Hollywood romance. No fairy tale declaration, something much steadier, deeper. We learned to understand each other's silences. Victor began waiting for me at the dining table instead of eating alone in his dark study. I started reading my books by the fireplace while he worked quietly at his desk. On Sundays, we would drive down winding mountain roads for hours simply to escape the ringing phones and the mountain of paperwork. One evening during a massive summer thunderstorm, the power completely went out across the entire ridge. We sat in the flickering candlelight, listening to the rain hammer the roof like bullets. Victor looked so much older in that weak light. "Fragile somehow. Do you regret marrying me, Elena?" he asked suddenly. I thought about it carefully before answering. "I regret why it happened," I said honestly. He nodded once. "That is fair." Then after a long, heavy silence, he surprised me again. "You deserved a proper beginning," he said quietly, "not the one your own father sold you for cash." No one had ever acknowledged my pain like that before. Not directly, not honestly. I felt hot tears sting my eyes, and I looked away embarrassed. Victor noticed anyway. "You know," he said softly, "your father has already called me 3 separate times asking for additional money since the wedding." I whipped my head around, staring at him. "Did you give it to him?" "The first 2 times, yes," he said, "but on the third call, I told him his daughter was a human being, not an investment account." Something fierce, protective, and fiercely loyal erupted in my chest in that exact moment. For the first time in my entire miserable life, someone had actually chosen my dignity over my father's endless greed. The fatal accident happened exactly 11 months later. Freezing rain covered the mountain highways that night. Victor had driven down to Denver for a series of high-stakes meetings, despite Walter explicitly warning him to wait until morning. At 11:38 p.m., the state patrol called the house. A single vehicle crash, guardrail failure. The vehicle had overturned violently into a deep ravine. Instant death. I remember dropping the phone. I remember Walter catching my body before I hit the hardwood floor. And I remember the awful, deafening silence that followed. The kind of silence that alters a house permanently. At the funeral, people spoke in soft, rehearsed voices about the tragedy while secretly measuring the inheritance with their eyes. Leonard Voss cried way too dramatically, wiping fake tears. My father flew all the way in from Ohio wearing a brand new designer suit nicer than anything he had owned in 20 years. That sickened me immediately, but it was nothing compared to what happened after the burial. I walked into Victor's private office searching for insurance documents when I noticed a thick, wax-sealed envelope on his desk. My name was written across the front in his sharp, distinct handwriting. Inside was a certified copy of his revised will. Everything. The commercial properties, the investments, the offshore accounts, all of it belonged to me. And attached to the very back was a small handwritten note. "If anything ever happens to me unexpectedly, Elena, trust absolutely no one in your family." 4 years after Victor died, people in Cedar Ridge still lowered their voices when I walked past. Some called me the grieving widow. Others called me incredibly lucky. A few whispered that I was dangerous. None of them knew the actual truth. The truth was much quieter than the small town gossip. Most mornings I woke up before sunrise, brewed a fresh pot of coffee in the same kitchen. Victor once stood in and watched the fresh snow settle over the mountain peaks while the giant house creaked softly around me. Grief changes its shape as time passes. At first, it is sharp enough to slice through your ribs every single hour. Later, it becomes heavier, slower, like carrying a soaking wet blanket that nobody else can see. For a very long time after Victor's death, I barely spoke to a soul outside of Walter Briggs and my primary attorney, Daniel Mercer. Walter checked on me almost daily during that brutal first year. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes he fixed broken hinges around the property just to stay busy, and sometimes we just sat on the porch in total silence while the freezing wind rolled through the pines. Older people understand silence so much better than the youth. Silence does not mean emptiness. Sometimes it means profound respect. Daniel Mercer became an anchor in my life shortly after the funeral. Victor had trusted him blindly for decades. Daniel was in his early 60s, incredibly sharp-minded, but completely calm with the kind of infinite patience only veteran corporate lawyers seem to possess. Not flashy, not theatrical, just metered and careful. The very first time we reviewed Victor's estate together, Daniel locked the heavy office door, turned around, and lowered his voice to a whisper. Victor believed someone in his inner circle was actively plotting to ruin him financially, Elena. I looked up from the paperwork immediately. You mean Leonard Voss? Daniel hesitated, adjusting his glasses. Among others, he said. That phrase echoed in my mind for days. Among others. At first, I assumed Daniel just meant greedy Wall Street associates. I did not yet understand how close to home those words actually hit. The first year after Victor's death felt like pure survival. The second year became a brutal financial education. By the third year, I started uncovering the hidden things Victor had deliberately left behind for me to find. Thousands of pages of encrypted records, secret contracts, strange property acquisitions, and private correspondence. Most widows probably would have handed the boxes to a team of accountants and walked away to a beach somewhere. But I remembered exactly what Victor had told me beside the fireplace during that snowstorm. Never ignore a paper trail. Elena, greedy people always leave their fingerprints somewhere. So day after day, night after night, I read, sometimes until 2 in the morning, until my eyes bled. At first, I found small irregularities, land purchases that made absolutely no economic sense. Payments routed through complex shell companies in Delaware. Construction bids that were mysteriously inflated by millions. Then I started noticing the exact same names repeating over and over. County officials, major developers, Leonard Voss, and eventually Raymond Carter. The very first time I saw my own father's name connected to Victor's private business files, I honestly thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But there it was in black and white. 3 separate massive payments spread across 18 months after my wedding day. Large payments far larger than any standard agricultural loan or gambling debt payoff. My hands shook so violently I dropped the papers on the desk. Victor had been entirely right. My father had not simply accepted a one-time payoff to save the farm. He had stayed connected to the machine afterward, somehow involved, somehow benefiting from Victor's world. That realization completely hollowed out my chest. Even after everything he put me through, a small, naive part of me still wanted to believe my father had just been desperate. Not corrupt, not knowingly dangerous, just weak. But weak men can destroy lives just as fast as monsters, especially when millions of dollars enter the room. The next massive discovery came directly from the encrypted security archives. Victor had covertly backed up all the property cameras during the final year of his life. Daniel helped me recover the deleted audio files. Most of the footage was completely useless deliveries, estate employees, local wildlife crossing the driveway at night. But occasionally there were conversations, secret conversations. One specific recording showed Leonard Voss arguing violently with Victor near the secondary garage 3 months before the fatal crash. I can still see Leonard's face turning bright crimson while the pouring rain hammered the concrete outside. You think you can just destroy everybody's lives and walk away completely clean, Leonard snapped. Victor answered him with a voice like ice. You already destroyed yourself, Leonard. Another recording captured something that made my heart completely stop beating. My father visiting the estate without ever telling me he was in Colorado. I nearly choked on my breath when I saw his face appear on the monitor. Victor met him privately near the back workshop. The audio was distorted by the howling wind, but parts of it remained brutally crystal clear. Dad sounded incredibly defensive and nervous. Victor sounded entirely furious. "You took the money," Raymond Victor said sharply. "I needed the help," my father muttered back. "You sold your own daughter because you needed help?" Dad snapped back, turning red. "You act like she is suffering living in luxury here." Victor stepped directly into his personal space. "This conversation ends right now," he warned. Then came the exact sentence that would haunt me for the rest of my days. "If anything ever happens to Elena because of your pathetic greed," Raymond Victor growled, "I will personally bury you financially until you are eating out of a dumpster." The footage cut to black right there. I sat frozen solid in Daniel's office for several minutes. Neither of us spoke a single word. Finally, Daniel removed his glasses, slowly sighed, and looked at me. "Elena," he said, "carefully Victor suspected a massive international financial fraud involving Leonard, several high-ranking county officials, and possibly your own father." I stared at the dark screen. "My father is just a corn farmer," I whispered. "He was a farmer," Daniel corrected quietly. That distinction chilled me more than the cold Colorado winter. By the 4th year after the crash, I had changed more than anyone realized. Back in Ohio, I had been timid, careful, always waiting for verbal permission before I spoke or moved. That weak girl completely disappeared somewhere between Victor's funeral and those endless midnight hours reviewing fraud records. I learned exactly how to negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts, how to aggressively manage international investments, and how to spot a manipulation tactic before it even entered the room. Victor had spent his final years teaching me things my own father never believed my small brain was capable of understanding. And slowly I stopped feeling afraid, not because my heart became hard, but because I became entirely prepared. And preparation matters so much more than fear. Then came the inevitable catalyst. A local Denver newspaper ran a front-page story mentioning that one of Victor's prime commercial properties had just sold for nearly $12 million cash. The financial story spread like wildfire across the country. Apparently, it traveled even faster back to the broke town of Ash Creek, Ohio. 3 days later, a massive black SUV pulled into my long gravel driveway just before sunset. I watched silently from the upstairs master bedroom window as my family climbed out of the vehicle. My father stepped out first, older, now heavier, but still carrying himself with that same disgusting false authority. My mother followed him out much more slowly, wrapped in a faded, pale blue winter coat, looking tired in a way that hurt my heart unexpectedly. My brother Dean stepped out last beside his snobby wife Cheryl, already surveying the massive stone estate like he was pricing the architecture for resale. Walter Briggs stood right beside me at the window, watching them through the glass. "Well," he muttered under his breath, "the vultures finally smelled the carcass." Despite the sheer disgust in my throat, I almost laughed. Almost. I met them at the massive front door. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody said a word. 4 long years without a single phone call or text message, and suddenly they are standing on my porch beneath the gray Colorado skies. Then my mother broke the silence by crying out my name. "Elena," she whispered, taking a step forward. Dad immediately blocked her and stepped ahead. "We should talk inside," he said firmly. Not a hello? Not "how have you been" after losing your husband. Straight to business. Some things truly never change. Still, I forced a polite, hospitable smile and opened the door wide. Of course, I said, "Come on in." What not a single one of them knew was that every single room in this house now had active, high-definition recording cameras with live audio feeds. Daniel Mercer was currently waiting upstairs, reviewing the latest legal documents, and Walter Briggs had already personally contacted the county sheriff earlier that afternoon after I informed him my family was inbound. Not because we were planning some petty cinematic revenge, but because older people have learned a vital rule of survival. When greedy, desperate people smell that much money, they become entirely unpredictable. Dinner felt almost normal at first. That was the most unsettling part of the entire evening. Mom complimented the custom silk curtains, Dean admired the expensive bourbon collection, and Dad slowly wandered through the open living room, staring at the artwork and antique furniture with poorly hidden resentment burning in his eyes. Then finally, he sat down directly across from me at the massive mahogany dining table, folded his hands tightly, and said the exact words I knew he had been rehearsing during the entire flight from Ohio. Family deserves to share what family helped build. Behind his back, in the shadows of the hallway, Walter quietly and firmly locked the heavy front door deadbolt. Family deserves to share what family helped build. My father repeated it calmly, reasonably, like he was discussing the local weather, instead of trying to violently claim pieces of a dead man's empire. The entire dining room fell into a dead, suffocating silence after that sentence. Outside the window, heavy snow drifted slowly past the glass while the grandfather clock near the staircase ticked so loudly it felt irritating. Dean leaned back in his leather chair and nodded aggressively like Dad had finally said the obvious thing everyone else was too polite to mention. Cheryl reached over for another warm dinner roll, and my mother just stared blankly at her untouched plate. I looked my father dead in the eyes for several long, agonizing seconds before answering him. What exactly did this family help build? I asked. Dad sighed heavily, already sounding entirely exhausted by my resistance. Elena, please, he started. No, I said softly and firmly, I would really like to know. His jaw tightened instantly, and the mask began to slip. That man would not have looked twice at a girl like you if I hadn't personally arranged the meeting and given my word, he hissed. There it was, not an ounce of guilt, not a shred of shame. Pure unadulterated ownership. Even after all these years of my suffering, he still genuinely believed my entire life was just a transaction he deserved a massive commission on. Walter Briggs stood perfectly still near the kitchen doorway, pretending to check the coffee pot while catching every single syllable. Dean pointed his silver fork directly at my face. You are acting like Dad didn't save your life too, he snapped. Save my life? I asked, turning to him. You lived in absolute luxury for 4 years. Elena Dean sneered most women back in Ash Creek would have literally killed for a life like this. Killed, I repeated. Interesting choice of words, Dean. Mom flinched violently when I said it. I noticed it immediately. I noticed everything now. The dinner continued with that strange, sickening politeness families use when everybody knows something incredibly ugly is waiting right underneath the table. Dad complimented the vintage red wine, Dean talked about the rising property taxes back in Ohio, and Cheryl asked fake, high-pitched questions about mountain life that she clearly did not give a damn about. Only my mother remained completely silent. Every now and then, I caught her staring at me with an expression that looked close to regret. Not enough real regret to stand up and stop this madness, but enough to hurt me anyway. Finally, Dad set his wine glass down hard on the table. Look, we didn't fly all the way across the country for small talk, he said, cutting through the noise. There it is, Walter muttered quietly from the kitchen doorway. Dad ignored him, entirely keeping his eyes locked on me. You inherited a massive fortune, Elena, because this family made immense sacrifices, he said. I stared at him completely unmoved. What sacrifice did you personally make, Dad? His expression hardened into stone. I did what I had to do to keep us alive, he said. That single sentence instantly pulled my mind backward through time. The farmhouse kitchen in Ohio, the freezing rain hitting the windows, his large hand slamming violently against the dinner table. I did what I had to do. It is funny how bad people reuse the exact same excuses their entire lives. I stood up slowly, picked up my wine glass, and walked toward the fireplace. Nobody spoke a single word while I moved across the room. The cameras mounted discreetly in the crown molding captured every single face, every guilty reaction, every single lie. You know something strange, I said quietly, turning back to them. Victor used to tell me that funerals always reveal people much faster than weddings do. Dean rolled his eyes and groaned. Oh, here we go with the dead guy quotes? I ignored him completely, keeping my eyes locked on my father. At his funeral, I continued, most people talked about their deep grief, Raymond. But you only talked about his commercial properties. His face changed slightly then, not full panic yet, just extreme caution. You were highly upset, Elena, he said, carefully rewriting history. I was just trying to be practical. I was not upset, I said calmly. I was observant. Walter crossed his massive arms over his chest. Dean shifted uncomfortably in his seat, making the leather creak. Mom looked like she wanted to melt into the floorboards and disappear entirely. I set my wine glass down on the mantelpiece. Victor knew the people around him were actively waiting for him to die, I said into the room. Nobody answered me. Even the massive house felt entirely still. Then Dad let out a harsh, mocking scoff. That old man was completely paranoid, he said. Yes, I agreed softly he was. I let the silence stretch out for another painful moment. But turns out he had very good reasons to be. What are you talking about? Dean suddenly leaned forward aggressively. Look, let's stop dancing around the issue here, Elena. Dad says Victor left you over $30 million after all the corporate assets cleared. There it was, the real conversation, not grief. Not a family reconciliation, just cold, hard cash, pure and simple. I nodded slowly. And you don't possibly need all of it. Cheryl immediately chimed in with a fake sweet smile, especially since you have no children to pass it to. That one hit much harder than she intended. Victor and I had tried quietly for 2 years to conceive before his health completely deteriorated. Nobody at that table knew that painful truth except for Walter. I saw dangerous anger flash briefly across Walter's weathered face. My mother whispered, Cheryl, please shut up, but Cheryl kept pushing right ahead. We are your family too. Elena and family takes care of family. That word sounded almost hysterical coming from people who had not checked if I was alive or dead once in 4 years. I walked slowly toward the built-in mahogany cabinet beside the fireplace and opened the top drawer. Dad's eyes followed my hands immediately, like a predator watching movement in the brush. Inside the drawer sat a small black remote control. Walter finally stepped fully out of the shadows and into the bright dining room light. Dean frowned, looking back and forth between us. What is this supposed to be, some kind of theatrical stunt, he sneered. I pressed the center button. The large television mounted right above the fireplace flickered to life. Security footage immediately appeared on the screen in sharp black and white. Heavy rain was pouring across Victor's gravel driveway. Then Leonard Voss stepped perfectly into the frame, arguing violently with Victor near the secondary garage. The entire dining room went completely dead silent. My father stared at the screen, his eyes widening as he instantly recognized the extreme seriousness of what he was looking at. Leonard's voice crackled loudly through the high-quality speakers. You think you can just destroy everybody's lives and walk away completely clean, Vic Leonard snapped. Victor answered him with that chilling, calm voice. You already destroyed yourself, Leonard. The recording continued for another agonizing minute before cutting to black. Dean looked genuinely confused. What the hell is this supposed to be? He asked. Evidence, I said calmly. Dad's voice lowered to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. Evidence of what, Elena? I met his panicked eyes directly. That depends entirely on how honest everyone wants to be with me tonight, Raymond. For the very first time since he walked into my home, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear flash across my father's face. Small, quick, but entirely real. I changed the footage. The next digital recording loaded instantly. My father immediately went bone white as he watched his own face appear on the massive screen walking beside Victor near the back workshop. Mom covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a soft gasp. Dean stared at the television blankly. What the hell is this? The wind badly distorted parts of the audio, but Victor's booming voice came through with absolute clarity. You sold your own daughter because you needed help. Nobody in the room moved. Nobody breathed. Dad whispered harshly, turn that off right now, Elena. I did not move a muscle. The recording played on. If anything ever happens to Elena because of your pathetic greed, Raymond Victor warned loudly, I will personally bury you financially. The video cut out. Silence completely swallowed the room. My father looked 10 years older all of a sudden. Not a sympathetic older, an exposed caught criminal older. Like decades of his pathetic excuses had finally collapsed under their own weight. Mom started sobbing quietly into her napkin. Dean looked back and forth between Dad and me, trying to decide which version of reality he was supposed to believe. Then Dad slammed his fist violently against the mahogany table. That dead man manipulated everything, he screamed. Walter spoke up for the first time in an hour, his voice booming with authority. Watch your tone, Raymond. Dad pointed a shaking finger at me furiously. She is twisting everything. She is setting me up. No, I said softly and matching his gaze. Victor recorded those conversations exactly as they happened. His breathing turned incredibly uneven. That caught my attention immediately because fear affects guilty people entirely differently than innocent ones. Innocent people get angry. Guilty people start calculating. Dad's eyes flicked briefly toward the front hallway door. Walter noticed it too. So now we are finally getting somewhere, Walter murmured, shifting his weight. I walked back toward the dining table slowly and stood at the head. You want to know what bothered me the most after Victor died? I asked the table. Nobody answered. It was not the millions of dollars, I continued. It was not even the crushing loneliness of this mountain house. I looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. It was the crushing realization that the very first person who ever protected my dignity in my entire life was the man this entire town called a dangerous monster. Mom began sobbing much harder after that comment. Dean just stared blankly at the table, unable to look at me. And Dad finally looked completely uncertain. Not powerful, not commanding, just a pathetic old man backed into a tight corner. Then I reached into my cardigan pocket, pulled out a key, and unlocked the lower cabinet drawer. I removed a thick, heavy manila folder. Daniel Mercer stepped quietly down the stairs for the very first time all evening. Dad's face completely drained of what little color it had left, because he recognized Victor's high-powered corporate attorney immediately. Daniel placed the heavy folder carefully in the exact center of the dining table, right next to the untouched roast. Inside this folder, Daniel said calmly, are certified copies of bank transfers, illegal land agreements, recorded cash payments, and corporate connections. Years of them, Mr. Carter. Before anyone attempts to leave this house tonight, there are several serious financial and criminal matters law enforcement would like clarified. Dad stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward. I am leaving this psycho house right now, he barked. Walter Briggs stepped directly between him and the hallway exit. Then, calm as a church pastor delivering Sunday scripture, Walter looked down at him and said, "Sit back down, Raymond." Walter didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't need to. Some men spend enough decades carrying real authority that their calmness becomes 1,000 times more terrifying than shouting. My father completely froze halfway between the dining chair and the hallway. For a solid, agonizing second, nobody moved a muscle. The grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner, the snow brushed against the windows, and Dean looked like a man slowly realizing that a free dinner had just become a federal trap. Dad tried forcing a sarcastic laugh. This is completely insane, he stammered. Daniel Mercer remained standing perfectly straight, hands folded neatly in front of his suit. No, Mr. Carter, Daniel said with a chilling, calm tone. What is truly insane is how long certain people believed nobody was paying attention. Dad dropped his eyes, his frantic gaze darting toward the cold, untouched roast beef in the center of the table. Nobody touched a single bite of food anymore. The expensive candlelight flickered across faces that suddenly looked 20 years older than they had just an hour ago. My mother kept crying quietly, burying her entire face into a stained linen napkin. Dean frantically rubbed both hands over his face, sweating through his cheap collar, while Cheryl stared at that heavy manila folder like it was a live bomb waiting to detonate. And me, I felt a strange, chilling wave of absolute calm wash over my chest. I was not triumphant. I was not screaming in anger. I was just completely finished hiding. And that is a very dangerous difference. People mistakenly think revenge feels explosive. In reality, true revenge feels incredibly quiet. It feels like finally setting down a crushing weight you have carried through the mud for too long. Daniel Mercer carefully turned to the next page of the ledger. Victor Hale began documenting severe financial irregularities approximately 18 months before his tragic death. He explained to the silent room. Dad immediately interrupted, his voice cracking with desperation. I don't know a single damn thing about Victor's corporate business dealings. Daniel did not blink. He simply slid 3 separate documents across the polished mahogany table. Bank transfers, electronic wire receipts, encrypted property agreements. My father recognized his own signature instantly. I saw the flash of recognition hit his eyes a split second before he tried to mask it with fake outrage. These specific cash payments, Daniel continued methodically, were deliberately routed through agricultural development accounts directly connected to Leonard Voss's shell companies. Dad's voice turned violently defensive. That was legal consulting work. I am a businessman. Walter Briggs let out a low, mocking grunt from the doorway. A bankrupt corn farmer from Ash Creek, Ohio, suddenly doing 6-figure corporate consulting for a multi-million-dollar development firm? Walter murmured. Dad snapped his head toward him, baring his teeth. You don't know a single damn thing about me or my struggles, Briggs. Walter stood his ground, his eyes hard as flint. I know exactly what you are, Raymond. Daniel continued his presentation with terrifying method. That was what made him a lethal attorney. No cheap drama, no empty threats, just cold, hard facts laid out slowly enough for guilt to suffocate under its own immense weight. Victor had successfully uncovered a massive land fraud scheme involving prime commercial development rights across 3 separate Colorado counties. Leonard Voss and several corrupt county officials were intentionally inflating property valuations before buying up the surrounding land through untraceable shell corporations. Victor discovered millions of dollars vanishing through completely falsified contracts. And somewhere along that crooked way, my own biological father became involved. Not as the brilliant mastermind, not even close. He was used as something far worse, a useful, disposable idiot. Dad kept shaking his head frantically, his voice dropping. I never wanted to hurt anybody. Nobody answered him immediately, because the entire room knew a painful reality that older people eventually learn through blood. You do not need to be the person pulling the trigger to help evil happen. Sometimes your cowardly silence does the exact same amount of damage. Dean finally broke, looking up with a face pale as paper. Dad, what exactly did you do? The question sounded so small, so completely stripped of his earlier arrogance. He sounded like a terrified little boy. Dad looked at his son helplessly, his shoulders sinking. I needed the cash. Dean, there is always an excuse for grease. Walter muttered from the shadows. Dad ignored him, tears finally welling in his eyes. The farm was completely collapsing under debt, he whispered. The bank was circling our land like wolves. Your mother was severely sick. Dean couldn't keep steady work back then. I was trying to protect us, so you sold Elena instead? Dean asked quietly, staring at our father with utter disgust. Dad slammed his clenched fist violently against the table. I saved this family, he roared. The words echoed loudly off the high ceilings. Mom flinched so hard her glass overturned, spilling dark red wine across the white tablecloth like fresh blood. Cheryl grabbed her arm, horrified. I stared at my father across the flickering candles and finally understood something I should have realized years ago. He truly deeply believed his own twisted justifications. That is the most dangerous thing about pathologically selfish people. Eventually, they rewrite their own memories until their survival tactics look like morality. Daniel calmly removed the final document from the folder. This specific paper was discovered in Victor Hale's locked private safe after his passing, Daniel said, looking directly at my father's pale face. Dad visibly stiffened, his breath hitching. It is a formal written statement prepared exactly 3 weeks before the vehicle crash. My own heartbeat slowed down immediately. I had never seen this document before in my life. Daniel unfolded the crisp paper and cleared his throat. Victor's bold signature sat clearly at the bottom. Daniel began reading the words aloud into the dead room. If harm comes to me unexpectedly, Leonard Voss should be thoroughly investigated for murder immediately. I also have definitive reason to believe Raymond Carter possesses critical information regarding financial coercion and illegal property acquisitions connected to Voss's operations. Mom gasped softly, pressing her hand to her throat. Dean looked physically sick to his stomach. Dad whispered, that is not legal proof of anything. No, Daniel agreed with a chilling smile. It is not, but this is. He slid a completely separate packet across the table. Certified maintenance reports, vehicle inspections, brake line repair records. Walter crossed his massive arms tighter over his chest while Daniel continued his flat, emotionless delivery. The official State Patrol accident report concluded Victor's vehicle lost all braking power during heavy mountain rain, Daniel said. Dad stared silently, sweat dripping down his temple. However, an independent mechanical review performed by our private experts later showed definitive, intentional tampering within the brake line assembly. The entire room went completely dead still. Even the grandfather clock seemed to quiet down. Cheryl whispered first, her voice trembling. "Oh my God." Dean turned his head slowly, looking directly at Dad. "You knew," Dean whispered. "You knew his brakes were cut." Dad's face twisted into an ugly mask, his eyes moving too fast, too sharp. No, I didn't know that, I swear," he stammered. Walter noticed the phrasing immediately. "So you already knew what Leonard was planning to do to him? You just didn't know how," Walter said quietly. My mother finally broke down entirely, her voice cracking open years of buried secrets. "I told you this would happen," she sobbed violently, turning on my father with a rage I had never seen in her. "You should have just left it alone, Raymond. You should have walked away after the courthouse wedding." Dad stared at her in absolute disbelief, his mouth open. "Margaret, shut your mouth." "No," she shouted even louder, tears streaming through her wrinkles. "You kept taking his money. You kept answering Leonard's late-night phone calls. You kept saying just one more real estate deal would fix everything and clear our names." Dean whispered, "Mom, stop." She looked toward me then, and what I saw in her eyes nearly broke whatever was left of my heart. It was not innocence. It was pure, unadulterated cowardice. "I wanted to call you so many times, Elena," she whispered, shaking her head, "but your father said Victor would find out and cut off our money forever." I let out a soft, dry laugh before I could stop myself. Not because it was funny, but because after all these miserable years, that was still their ultimate excuse: fear. Always pathetic fear. Fear of losing their unearned comfort. Fear of losing cash. Fear of angering powerful men. People destroy their children every single day just to avoid a little bit of personal discomfort. Dad suddenly stood up again, but this time, all the fake fight had completely drained out of his spine. He looked utterly exhausted, smaller and older than I had ever seen him in my life. "I never touched those brakes, Elena," he said quietly, his voice hollow. Nobody argued with him. Because deep down in my gut, I actually believed him. My father was a coward, and cowards are never brave enough for actual murder. But bravery is not a requirement for complicity. I didn't think Leonard would actually kill him. His voice cracked slightly. I thought Victor would just settle financially with him and walk away from the company. Walter's expression hardened into pure disgust. "And when he died instead, Raymond, you just sat there on your porch." Dad sat heavily back into his chair, his head buried in his hands. "I told myself it was just a coincidence," he whispered. A long, heavy silence settled over the room. Then Walter finally spoke, his deep voice carrying the weight of a judge. "You know what separates a decent man from a total coward? Raymond." Dad did not look up. Decent men tell the entire truth before the funeral happens. About 30 minutes later, 2 county deputy cruisers arrived quietly at the estate. No flashing lights, no dramatic sirens, no handcuffs, no screaming. Just a quiet, professional line of questioning waiting to begin at the station. Dad cooperated immediately the exact second he realized the paper evidence already existed in black and white. Dean sat completely motionless at the table, staring blankly at the floorboards, while Cheryl sobbed silently beside him. Mom looked entirely shattered, like a ghost wrapped in a blue coat. Before the deputies escorted Dad outside into the freezing Colorado night for formal questioning, he paused directly beside the dining table. He looked at me, and for the very first time in my entire life, Raymond Carter looked truly ashamed. Not defensive, not proud, ashamed. "Elena," he said weakly, his voice trembling, "I did love you." I held his pathetic gaze steadily, my voice completely flat. "You loved surviving more?" "Dad." He lowered his head after that, stepping out into the snow, and somehow that honesty hurt worse than if he had stood there and argued with me. Later that night, after everyone had finally left, the massive house became completely quiet again. Walter poured 2 hot cups of black coffee while the heavy snow completely covered the driveway outside, erasing their tire tracks. Daniel gathered his legal paperwork silently upstairs. I stood completely alone near the darkened living room window, looking at Victor's reflection in my old memories more than the glass. Walter handed me a warm ceramic mug gently. "You going to be all right, kiddo?" he asked. I thought about the question honestly for a long time, then answered the only way I knew how. I think tonight was the very first time in my life I stopped being afraid of them. Walter. Walter nodded slowly, a small smile appearing under his white mustache. That is usually exactly when the healing starts, Elena. The first time I went back to visit my father after the state investigation concluded, he looked 20 years older, not because of a harsh prison sentence. He never actually went to a state prison. His advanced age and failing health handled the punishment long before the local courts fully could. By the time winter settled over Ohio again, Raymond Carter had already lost every single thing that mattered to his ego. The generational farm was completely gone, sold to pay off the massive debt. The state fraud investigations completely destroyed what little remained of his personal finances. Several corrupt county officials accepted quick plea deals and testified aggressively against Leonard Voss, whose entire multi-million-dollar fraud operation collapsed publicly within a matter of months. Voss himself died before he ever stood trial, suffering a massive stroke at a private medical rehabilitation facility in Arizona. Walter told me men like Leonard rarely survive once their stolen money stops protecting them from reality. Maybe he was entirely right. As for my father, the courts legally determined he had knowingly participated in fraudulent financial arrangements tied directly to Voss's operations, though investigators found zero physical evidence directly linking his hands to Victor's murder. Cowardice, not physical violence. That was Raymond Carter's true crime. He saw the freight train of danger coming, and he chose absolute silence because he thought a little bit of dirty money might save his skin in the end. It completely ruined him anyway. There is probably a massive lesson in that for everyone. After the deputies finished questioning him in Colorado, Dad returned to Ohio under strict legal supervision while teams of attorneys sorted through months of complex financial investigations. We barely spoke a single word during that entire year. Honestly, I vastly preferred it that way. Some deep wounds need absolute distance before they can ever begin to heal cleanly. Mom called me occasionally, short, incredibly careful phone conversations. She sounded so incredibly tired now, in a specific way that I recognized immediately. People who spend consecutive decades trapped beside highly controlling, narcissistic men eventually begin to shrink emotionally. By the time their actual freedom arrives, many of them barely even know what to do with it. One afternoon in early spring, she finally admitted a hard truth quietly over the receiver. "I should have taken you and left him 20 years ago. Elena." I stood in Victor's modern kitchen holding the phone, watching the white snow melt slowly off the pine branches outside the window. "Yes, Mom, you should have," I answered honestly. A long silence followed, then the sound of soft, proper crying. Older people understand something that the youth often fight against. Sometimes the raw truth hurts a lot less than pretending. The local newspapers eventually picked up the full scope of the story. Regional coverage, Colorado land fraud investigations, suspicious financial networks, and deep questions surrounding the late Victor Hale's death. For the very first time in decades, the public openly reconsidered who Victor Hale had actually been. That specific shift mattered to me so much more than the massive multi-million-dollar inheritance ever did, because the absolute truth was simple. Victor Hale had not been a perfect saint, but he had been a decent, lonely, fiercely guarded man. Difficult sometimes, but decent. And in the end, the man that the entire county feared turned out to be the only human being who ever truly protected my dignity. Life has a very strange, dark sense of humor like that. About 6 months after the massive federal investigation officially closed, Walter Briggs drove me out to the old historic cemetery outside of Cedar Ridge, where Victor was buried. The rugged mountains stood completely quiet beneath the pale autumn clouds. Walter walked much slower these days, old age finally catching up to his massive frame. Still stubborn though, still refusing to let me carry anything heavier than a bag of groceries. We stood quietly beside Victor's gray granite headstone while a cold wind stirred the fallen orange leaves around our boots. Walter adjusted his heavy coat collar and spat into the grass. You know, he muttered, Victor would have absolutely hated all this public attention. Elena, I smiled softly, wiping a stray tear. I know, Walter. He liked his privacy more than breathing. That he did? Walter looked toward the peaks for a while before speaking again. You gave your old man a lot of mercy he probably didn't deserve from you? Kid, I thought carefully about his words. Maybe he was right. When the state prosecutors explicitly asked me whether I wanted harsher financial charges pursued against my father personally, I cooperated honestly with the facts, but I formally declined to push aggressively for maximum penalties. Some people in town called me completely foolish afterward. Maybe they were right too, but revenge changes its shape eventually. At first, you want absolute suffering. Then later, if you are lucky, you simply want peace. I didn't spare him because he earned it. Walter, I finally said, looking at the stone. Why then, Walter asked, looking at me sideways. Because I was entirely tired of becoming smaller every single time I hated him. Walter nodded slowly, a look of deep respect in his old eyes. Older men always appreciate an honest answer. That winter, I flew back to Ohio for the very first time in nearly 5 long years. Ash Creek looked so much smaller than I remembered it as a child. It is funny how childhood towns completely shrink once fear stops magnifying them in your mind. The old Carter farm had already been sold off to a massive commercial agriculture conglomerate. Seeing giant, strangers' green equipment parked beside our old red barn should have hurt a lot more than it did. Instead, I mostly just felt tired. My father now rented a tiny, single-story house outside of town, right near the noisy highway. Nothing fancy, nothing impressive. Just a quiet, tiny place with peeling white paint and a sagging wood porch swing. Mom opened the front door when I pulled up. For a long second, we simply stared at each other through the screen. Then she threw her arms around me and hugged me tightly. Not a dramatic Hollywood movie hug, just a tight, heavy embrace, like someone finally letting themselves grieve properly after a lifetime of holding their breath. Dad sat quietly at the small kitchen table when I walked inside. The sight of him shocked my system more than I expected. He looked completely frail, small. His shoulders curved heavily inward now instead of outward. His stubborn pride had finally stopped holding his spine together. For several long seconds, neither of us said a word. Then he quietly looked up and said, "You came." I sat down across from him slowly at the vinyl table. "You asked me to," I replied. The tiny kitchen smelled faintly like black coffee and old wood polish. It was almost identical to the old farmhouse years ago, except now everything felt so much quieter. Safer, somehow. Dad stared down blankly at his calloused hands. I used to think survival justified absolutely every single sin. Elena, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I listened in complete silence. When I was a young boy, my father lost his job during the massive steel layoffs. Raymond whispered, his eyes distant. We nearly lost every single thing we owned. He swallowed hard, his jaw trembling. I promised myself my own family would never feel that completely helpless again. I understood that fear. Many Americans his age did. The massive factories closed, the family farms vanished, and men who were raised to believe that providing defined their entire human worth suddenly found themselves entirely terrified. Extreme fear changes people. Sometimes it turns them into fierce protectors. And sometimes it turns them into complete cowards. I kept telling myself I was saving us, Elena, he whispered, a tear dropping onto his thumb. I looked at him carefully, my voice steady. And when exactly did saving us become selling me, Dad? That single question broke something deep inside him finally. Dad covered his eyes with both hands, his shoulders shaking. No excuses this time, no toxic anger, unadulterated shame. I don't know, he admitted softly. And somehow that bare honesty actually mattered to me. Not nearly enough to erase the horrors of the past. Nothing ever could, but just enough to stop carrying all that poison alone in the dark. Before leaving Ohio for good, I visited the old historic church cemetery where my grandparents were buried. Small towns always bury generations close together. Maybe that is exactly why old rural communities remember both kindness and cruelty for so many decades. On the long flight back to Colorado, I kept thinking about Victor, about Walter, about the incredibly strange, jagged road my life had taken, because one lonely, guarded man saw real value in me before I ever had the courage to see it in myself. A month later, I officially established the Hale Foundation using a massive portion of Victor's corporate estate. Nothing flashy, no giant billboards, just quiet, useful things. College scholarships for rural students who want to escape, full legal support for widows facing corrupt property disputes, and emergency housing assistance for women escaping violently abusive situations. Quiet things, useful things, the exact kind of work Victor would have highly approved of while aggressively pretending not to care. The final time I visited Victor's grave, bright spring sunlight completely covered the mountains behind the historic cemetery. I placed fresh yellow flowers beside the granite headstone and stood there for a long while, simply listening to the wind move through the massive pine trees. Then I spoke the exact words I should have spoken to him years earlier. You were the very first person who ever taught me that my life belonged to me. Victor, thank you. And for the very first time in a very long while, the deep silence that followed felt completely peaceful.